God, source of all light, by your word you give light to the soul. Pour out on us the spirit of wisdom and understanding, that our hearts and minds may be opened. Amen.
As soon as Jesus left the meeting place with James and John, they went home with Simon and Andrew. When they got there, Jesus was told that Simon's mother-in-law was sick in bed with fever. Jesus went to her. He took hold of her hand and helped her up. The fever left her, and she served them a meal. That evening, after sunset, all who were sick or had demons in them were brought to Jesus. In fact, the whole town gathered around the door of the house. Jesus healed all kinds of terrible diseases and forced out a lot of demons. But the demons knew who he was, and he did not let them speak. Very early the next morning, Jesus got up and went to a place where he could be alone and pray. Simon and the others started looking for him. And when they found him, they said, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "We must go to the nearby towns so that I can tell the good news to those people. This is why I have come." Then Jesus went to Jewish meeting places everywhere in Galilee, where he preached and forced out demons. A man with leprosy came to Jesus and knelt down. He begged, "You have the power to make me well, if only you wanted to." Jesus felt sorry for the man, so he put his hand on him and said, "I want to. Now you are well." At once, the man's leprosy disappeared, and he was well. After Jesus strictly warned the man, he sent him on his way. He said, "Don't tell anyone about this. Just go and show the priest that you are well. Then take a gift to the temple, as Moses commanded, and everyone will know that you have been healed." The man talked about it so much and told so many people that Jesus could no longer go openly into a town. He had to stay away from the towns, but people still came to him from everywhere.
Well, do it myself. You put it together, you go over it at 8 o'clock this morning, everything works great. You know that. Just call it oppression of technology. How's that sound? We are at the end of Matthew 1. That means we have 15 more chapters to go. So we are doing rather well. That is not the first slide. Don't think it is the first slide. Okay. To make matters worse, there's another slide missing, so I'll just have to tell you what's on it. You have to come back in time with me. And we're not going back to Jesus' time today. We're going to when the book of Mark was written. The Gospel of Mark was written. So we're in the range somewhere between 50 and 65. So if you close your eyes, you can imagine what's going on. You know, a lot of togans, a lot of Romans, a lot of Jews, a lot of peasants. Things are just pretty sad. In Judea and Galilee, these people have been oppressed. They've been oppressed since 586 when the Babylonians came down and destroyed Jerusalem, the temple, and the people went into exile. The Persians let the Hebrews come back to their land, but they were still under the oppression of the empire. And then the Greeks come in, and they're even more oppressive. And for a short period of time, depending on whose history you read, Judea was a free nation. Well, that is not exactly true, because wars continue between Greeks and Egyptians. So they're in a war-torn area with semi-independence, if you will. And then Romans come in, and of course, we're back to oppression. So as marked down, this is 50 to 60, somewhere, we don't know exactly, but in that range. And we know that it's somewhere in that range because of language. It's the language of the Gospel of Mark that gives us an idea of when it's been written. It's the same as if you're reading a book and you're reading about something called an aeroplane. You know that it was written somewhat after 1902, isn't that when Orville Wilbur did their thing? And if you hear about spaceships and rockets and all that jazz, you know that you're past 1960. So let's just put the book there for a moment, because that's a pretty important backdrop. Things stink. They are bad. For the people of Judea and Galilee, they are oppressed, they're fractured, they're angry, they're overtaxed, underfed, the whole bit. It's bad. And the one thing that they needed more than anything was some kind of unity. Different groups started to form, and these groups actually started back in the Greek period. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, on and on and on I could go. These groups formed over 150 years before Jesus was even on the scene. And as oppression continued, and we're in now 50 to 60, things are just bad. And the Zealots especially want to kick the Romans out. You have the Pharisees, especially Sadducees, who love the Greeks and the Romans, because history tells us that the high priest and the people that were put in charge, leaders, were done, that the Greeks put them in power. The Romans kept them in power. They're considered collaborators. We don't like collaborators if we're just the peasants being oppressed. So you start to get the feeling of what's going on. It's really, really bad. And these factions are going to start fighting with each other because they don't understand that they needed to come together. When you have a common enemy, people come together. If you think about your life and where you worked, you might experience that. When I was at General Defense or Flinchball Products, it was called here in Red Lion, we had a president who was so bad. How bad was he? All the management and everyone who worked in the company just wanted him to not come down to the shop floor. Don't come into my department area, because you knew it was just going to be blood everywhere. And people band together when they have a common enemy. And then after the company moved on a little bit, we had a new management group came in who kind of did the touchy-feely thing. We lost the enemy, and things just really tumbled. I don't know if anyone here actually worked in Redline. That would be like 1985 to 88. Now I'm really dating myself, aren't I? But when I was at Warner Lambert, the same thing happened. When Herman Armstrong was he made himself the common enemy, everybody worked together. And the minute he retired and the new guy from Australia came in and made everything touchy-feely, he wasn't the enemy anymore, everything kind of fell apart. Well, you've got that going on here. A common enemy is the Romans at this point. But we have disunity. The people did not want to come together. Their factions had been around for a couple hundred years. Things stunk. Got the background? Probably more than you wanted to know. So now we come into the first of the healings. The first one is going to be Jesus going to Simon's house and curing his mother-in-law of a fever. Very simple story. I'm not sure why Mark has it in there. It's a nice transition, perhaps, to what's going to happen. But the important thing is we have a Sabbath healing, but nobody's around. It's very privately done. That's going to happen later. And it's going to get really ugly later for other reasons, which we'll worry about when we get to it. And then we have this healing of the leper. First thing we know is the scripture said, and evening came. Well, that means you're in the next day. You have to remember their calendar is different than ours. So if you go to the Middle East, they count the beginning of the day as what we call 6 p.m., sunset. Whenever sunset hits, next day. In the Middle East, it's only going to vary about 5-10 minutes. As you get closer to the equator, you get closer to 6 to 6. So we are definitely in the next day. We would call it Sunday, but it's actually Saturday night for us. We're in the next day. Leprosy was any kind of skin disease. Now, when we think of it today, that's the one where your skin peels off and you can't grow skin. It's caused by hygiene. It's not a disease that you get from anything. But if you were thrown in a dungeon in Jerusalem, this is not a good place to be. There was no hygiene. You didn't get clean food or water. They didn't clean out your cell. You can imagine the stench itself. Bad hygiene causes leprosy. They didn't know that. Any skin disease, you're going to be put outside of the community immediately. And there are other laws that pertain to leprosy, and one of them is you're not allowed to touch someone who had leprosy. Why? Well, think about it. They didn't know that this was not a transmitted disease. If you touch someone who has what we call leprosy today, you will not get it. It's not a bacterial, it's not a viral, it's a hygiene disease. But people didn't know that. So in order to save lives, they said, we have a law, you don't touch someone with leprosy. Be that as it may. And now Jesus comes along, and what did he do? He touches the guy. He touched him. Can you imagine the panic that must have happened? Not only did he break the law, but he's got 4 followers, disciples. Other people are showing up, and here he goes, and he's touching the leper. Everybody probably figured he's going to be a leper in a day or two. They didn't know any better. But he had courage. What do you think about that? He had the courage to do what he did. He may have thought he was getting leprosy, but he didn't worry about it. He was very brave to go ahead and do it. As we continue, we see the pattern in Mark of Jesus' healings. People are going to be brought to him to be healed. He doesn't seek them out. He doesn't have to walk around and knock on doors and say, hey, are you sick in there? No, he doesn't have to do that. They're going to bring him. They're going to bring people to him. People are going to flock to him. They often will come with the help of the family or the friends, depending on how much detail is in there. And then Jesus encounters the person, usually with some kind of dialogue. Would you like to be healed? What is going on? There's something he's going to say. And sometimes he will respond to the request for healing. When the person says, please heal me, he will touch them. Or he's going to say some words. He's going to do some healings in Mark, just like we saw in Matthew, where he never sees the person. That's coming up a lot later. Those are previews. I'm giving you the trailer of the next couple of chapters, right? Is that what we call it today? And then what happens is, even though Jesus says, please don't tell anybody about it, that person who's been healed is going to go tell everyone. If you had leprosy and he touched you and your leprosy is gone, how could you not rejoice? You're going to go out and thank God for Jesus who healed you. Why did Jesus want it to be quiet? Because of the tension that's going on. He was concerned that the people might grab him and say, you are the king. You are the Messiah. He didn't want that yet. Not yet. That's not happening. It's too early for that to even be thinking of. But that would have started a really big revolt. That would have been really, really bad. But stop and think about the healings for just a moment with me. As I thought about them this week, they're actually metaphors. They're metaphors for unity. Because I said, when the guy got leprosy, what did they do with him? They put him over there. They put him out of the community. They said, you can't come into the synagogue. You can't come into the temple. You can't come into the marketplace. You're separated. You're off now off to the side. All of these healings go that way. People that had diseases, people that had infirmities, whatever the disease was, mental illness, we put them over there and we got rid of them. And think of it as, for a moment, as a metaphor of Jesus saying, you people have to come together and be united. You are the family of God. We are all the family of God, and we all need to be unified and together and work together. And if those factions would have come together and worked together and cared about their community as a whole, opposed to what they believed, because each one had a different set of beliefs, then maybe they could have gotten rid of the Romans. Or at least they could have learned to compromise and live with them a little better. All zealots wanted to do was kill them. All the priestly class wanted to do was collaborate. And then we had all the groups in between that had different ideas about things. One of the things Jesus talked about is unity and coming together as the people of God. That God didn't put us on the planet to kill each other. God put us on the planet to care and love for each other. It's obvious that has not been happening today. It doesn't happen in the church. It doesn't happen in society. So I started thinking about that a little bit more and said, what can we say that maybe help us become united? And maybe it's because we don't understand what's going on. Why are there groups now that think so differently than some of us? There's different groups that form. And we're going to put it into two groups. I mean, we're doing a big generalization that anthropologists have done. And we're calling it modernism. That's people who believe in individualism. Well, let me put it up there so you can see it. Now, do bear in mind my diagram where it says common to both. There actually was a little circle there that isn't there. Yeah, you probably need your awkward glasses for this one. It looks really good. Doesn't it look good on the screen back there? Yeah. See, she can read it. Can't you read it? No. Okay. Well, how about I read it for you? See, if you do this, everyone. If you were up here and I had a camera, everyone you now started going, I can't see that. I got your attention, didn't I? Back there. It's an old trick I learned in the 90s. Okay. Modern thinking. The modern period starts around 1500. Feudalism before that. Modernism started. Now here's the thing, before I get that list, let me tell you something I also discovered. First, in 2005, I put together an entire class of over 12 hours to teach church leaders what postmodernism was about. Because it's coming. It's here. You can't stop it. And one of the things that every one of the books said is that it's an age thing. Every one of them. Today, most analysts would look at you and say, if you're under 35, more than likely, you are a postmodern thinker, and if you're over, you're a modern thinker. That worked in 2005. Doesn't work today. It's wrong to think that way. Age does not have a factor in this anymore. There are plenty of people that I know who are like us and like you. I just realized I'm not the youngest one here this morning. That's so good to know. Thank you for being here. You young people. Young people here, isn't that great? Just because you're young, just because you're old, it doesn't matter. I know older people that are postmodern thinkers. And I know a lot of young people who are modern thinkers. So get rid of the age thing that we've been told for 15 to 20 years, because that's wrong. It's not there anymore. It was in 2005. It isn't here today. Okay, modern thinkers include individualism, self-reliance, liberty, justice, property, rights, and laws. I am not using a political label. Please do not think politically. But I'm sure you can align them up. They're going to align up, but I don't talk that way. We are talking about Jesus saying we have to have unity. In order to have unity in the church and the society, we have to understand what the other group's thinking. You're going to flop into it. And more than likely, you're somewhere in the common to both. And some things you probably are postmodern, and some thinking you're modern. Which is fine. That's what it should be. The way it is. Postmodern thinkers are community-oriented, group reliance. They look for equity, multiple truths, and they are skeptical. And that's the problem of compromise. They're skeptical of modern ideas, and they believe in social conditioning. That's the fight. It's a war between these two groups that we're seeing today. In the same way, if you go back to the writing of Mark, they had more groups that were fighting, but essentially they had a bunch of groups fighting each other because nobody would compromise and nobody understood what group was doing what and why. We have to accept that there are postmodern thinkers, young, old, all over, that think differently than if you're a modern thinker. And if you're a postmodern, you see that. And I think when we go back a good 20 years, we saw compromise on all levels. But it has totally infected the church to the point where we are splitting apart because of that. Because we don't know how to compromise anymore. I think we've lost that ability. That could be just my opinion, but that's what I'm supposed to do and look at this. I think we've lost it. If you've looked at the last of the general conferences, and I've been watching them and going to them, I don't go to them, I've watched them for the last 24 years, you can just see the decay of compromise continuing. And what happens in the church happens in society, and what happens in society happens in the church. And we used to be able to compromise at all levels. But we've lost it. There's no unity anymore. And when we sit here and we're talking about Jesus' message to us through the healings, and in general, he's saying to us, as he said to people then, you got to start being unified. You have to work together. You have to compromise because everyone thinks differently. God gave us that gift. We call it free will, free choice, whatever. We're all allowed to think differently, but we got to work together for the common good, or we're just going to tear ourselves apart. And as I described, think about that, 50, 60 in Judea and the Galilee, because the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, because none of them would compromise, their lives were horrible, and it was torn to shreds. It was a terrible life to be in that time period. And Jesus comes along and says, you got to compromise. Why? Because you need unity. And God wants us all to live together with our differences, and we need to celebrate differences and accept it. And that is a really hard pill to swallow when you look at that chart. If you want it, I'll be happy to email it to you. The information comes off the internet. I didn't make any of those terms up. But that's what's killing us. Why have we lost the ability to compromise? Again, if you're on the modern side, there are postmodern thinking you don't like. If you're a postmodern thinker, there's things on the modern side you don't like. Fine. But compromise and unity is the whole gig. Next year, the General Conference is going to divide. I have no doubt about it. Everybody's saying that. It's a bad thing. Why? Because for 20 years they've been fighting, and I'm talking about delegates, fighting instead of compromising. They lost the lesson that Jesus tells us, because these healing stories, Jesus is saying nobody gets put out. Everybody should be together. We should have unity. We should care for one another. We need to compromise. That's the message, I think, that comes through a lot of the healing stories. And as we continue, you're going to see more of it. And Jesus had the courage to tell them, you've got to let the leper come into worship, and I'll heal him. Now, was it really a physical healing? Let's say yes, that's fine. But it also allowed that leper to come back into the synagogue, back into the temple, back into the house of God. Unity. And you're going to see it through all of these. But Jesus had the courage to do it. And if you think about that call for unity is going to put him on the cross with some other things. But that was the big one. Why? Because even Pharisees and Sadducees could not agree in compromise to work together. The Essenes said, we don't like anything, and they went to a place called Qumran in the mountains, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They hated it so much that they went away from everything. Anyone ever been to the Ephrata cloister? That's what 200 people did 250 years ago. And they said, no children and no outsiders, because we don't like what's going on out there. They didn't want to compromise. Of course, they're all gone. You don't let outsiders in, you don't have kids, you know what's going to happen. Jesus was set with part of his message, and a big part, in my opinion, is the unity of people. To compromise, to work together, to understand we all have differences, and differences of opinion, and appreciate that. So today the question for us is, who will God send with the courage to restore compromise in the church and society? We think about the words in Isaiah 6, where God said, in heaven, who will I send? And Isaiah stood up and said, I'll go. We even have a song about that, don't we, Dennis? So the question is, who's he going to send? And maybe the message to all of us is, it should be the church in general. All of us should be. When you think about why we have the decrease in membership and the decrease in attendance, could it be because people can see the infighting here? And if all that infighting, you have all that infighting, if you will, out in society, people want to come to a place where there's no fighting, where people work together and compromise and love each other. And every time I think about it, Jesus said, love one another, forgive one another, tolerate each other, and live in unity. And you see churches not. People read the newspapers about what's going on with our General Conference. Right now it's quiet because there are other things going on. It's going to perk up again next May when the whole General Conference starts again. That looks horrible for us. Why would I go to a church that's disunified? It's got to start somewhere. Maybe it's got to start with us. To look at that chart and say, okay, I don't agree with everything in that other circle, but there's a lot of places we can compromise and we can learn to live together. So Jesus talked about unity and living together. And maybe you're one that he's going to choose. Maybe he's going to choose all of us to be the ones that go out there and say, it's time to live and work together, understanding our differences. And someone just beat telling me I'm done. So I'm done.